For 20 years, Rose Mitchell and Jacob Coleman had knelt in the dust of their Montana ranch, praying to a God who seemed to have forgotten their address. They'd begged for tiny hands to help with harvest, small voices to fill the endless silence of their sprawling homestead, but heaven answered only with wind through empty cradles and the hollow echo of their own footsteps in a house built for children who never came. Then one autumn morning in 1887, when hope had grown as brittle as winter wheat, 3 shadows huddled in their old gristmill would change everything they thought they knew about answered prayers. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly in all directions from the Coleman Ranch, a sea of golden grassland that rolled like frozen waves toward the distant peaks of the Beartooth Mountains. Jacob Coleman stood on the wraparound porch of his 2-story log home, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of copper and rose. At 43, he carried the lean strength of a man who'd built everything he owned with his own hands, but his eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor. 20 years. 20 years since he'd married Rose Mitchell. In the little church in Billings, both of them barely past 20 and drunk on dreams of filling their new home with the laughter of children. Rose had been the prettiest schoolteacher in 3 counties, with auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and a smile that could gentle wild horses.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Jacob had been the ambitious young rancher with 2,000 acres of prime grazing land and a heart full of plans for the dynasty he'd build. Now Rose stood in the kitchen behind him, the same auburn hair streaked with silver, the same gentle hands that had once taught children their letters, now kneading bread for just the 2 of them. She moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd learned to fill her days with purpose even when purpose felt hollow. Through the window, Jacob could see her reflection as she worked, and his chest tightened with the familiar ache of love mixed with shared sorrow. Coffee's getting cold, Jake, Rose called softly, her voice carrying the hint of Irish accent she'd inherited from her grandmother. She didn't look up from her work, but he knew she'd been watching him watch the sunrise, both of them caught in the same morning ritual they'd performed for years. They'd learned to speak around their grief, to love each other through the spaces where children's voices should have been. Jacob drained his cup and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of their home wrapping around him like an old coat. Rose had made this house beautiful despite everything, with quilts she'd sewn during long winter evenings and wildflowers she gathered each spring. The parlor held a piano that had cost him 3 months' worth of cattle sales, bought because Rose played like an angel, and he'd imagined teaching small fingers to find the keys. Now it sat mostly silent, though sometimes on Sunday evenings she'd play hymns while he sat beside her, both of them pretending not to notice the empty chairs arranged hopefully around the room. Hendricks is bringing his crew by this morning to help with the mill repairs, Jacob said, settling at the kitchen table where Rose had laid out eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. Says the grinding stones need resetting before winter wheat comes in. He kept his voice matter of fact, though they both knew the mill had been grinding grain just fine. Bill Hendricks was their closest neighbor, a good man with 6 children, who understood without being told that sometimes Jacob and Rose needed projects that brought other people's families around. Rose nodded, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "I'll make extra lunch then. Mary Hendricks will probably come along with little Samuel, and you know how that boy eats." She smiled as she said it, the genuine warmth she always showed for other people's children. Jacob had watched her over the years with the neighbor kids, had seen how naturally they gravitated toward her, how she never seemed to feel the bitter envy that might have been understandable. Instead, she loved them all with a fierce protectiveness that made their parents trust her completely. The mill stood about a quarter mile from the main house, near the creek that provided its power. Jacob's grandfather had built it when he first claimed this land in 1855, and it had been grinding grain for settlers and ranchers throughout the valley ever since. The building was solid stone and timber, built to last generations, with a great wooden water wheel that turned steadily in the creek's flow. Inside, the grinding stones were massive affairs, carved from granite and fitted so precisely that they could turn the hardest wheat into flour fine enough for birthday cakes. Jacob had always loved the mill, loved the honest work of it, the way it served the whole community. But lately, something about the building made him sad in a way he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way the empty grain sacks hung like ghosts in the storage room, or how his footsteps echoed too loudly in the space. He'd built this mill thinking about the sons who would learn its workings, the daughters who might help their mother bake bread from its flour. Instead, it had become just another reminder of the family that existed only in his imagination. Rose packed enough lunch for an army, as she always did when the neighbors came to help. She hummed while she worked, an old hymn Jacob recognized but couldn't name, her voice still sweet after all these years. He found himself watching her move around their kitchen and wondering, not for the first time, if she might have been happier. Married to a man who could have given her children. She'd never said so, never even hinted at regret, but sometimes he caught her looking out toward the road with an expression he couldn't read. "Penny for your thoughts," Rose said, startling him from his reverie. She was standing beside his chair now, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You've got that look again, Jake Coleman. The one that means you're borrowing trouble from tomorrow." Her touch was warm through his shirt, familiar and comforting. And he covered her hand with his own. "Just thinking about the mill," he said, which was partly true. "Wondering if it's worth all the fuss to keep it running. Might be time to tear it down, use the stone for something else." He felt her stiffen slightly under his hand, though her voice remained steady when she answered, "That mill feeds half the valley, and you know it. Besides, your grandfather would rise up from his grave if you even thought about tearing down his life's work." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Some things are worth preserving, Jake, even if they don't make perfect sense anymore. Especially then." There was something in her voice, a deeper meaning he almost grasped. But then Bill Hendrick's wagon was rattling into the yard, and the moment passed. The work crew consisted of Bill, his two oldest boys, and 3 ranch hands from the neighboring spread. They attacked the mill repairs with the methodical efficiency of men who understood machinery, dismantling the grinding mechanism piece by piece, while Jacob explained what he thought might be wrong. The truth was, there wasn't much wrong with the mill that a good cleaning wouldn't fix, but having a project gave them all an excuse to spend the day together, sharing stories and catching up on valley news. Rose arrived at midday with lunch. Enough for twice their number, accompanied by Mary Hendricks and her youngest son, 4-year-old Samuel. The boy was all energy and curiosity, darting between the men's legs and endless questions about how everything worked. Jacob found himself explaining the mill's operation with the patience he'd always imagined showing his own sons, while Samuel listened with the intense concentration only small children could manage. "Uncle Jake, why does the wheel go round and round?" Samuel asked, using the honorary title all the valley children gave him. His small hand was sticky with molasses from his lunch biscuit, and there was flour in his dark hair from investigating the grain sacks. Jacob knelt down to the boy's level, pointing toward the creek that powered the great wheel. "See how the water pushes against those paddles, Samuel. The creek never stops flowing, so the wheel never stops turning, and that makes the big stones. Inside grind the wheat into flour for your mama's bread." He lifted the boy up so he could see better, feeling the solid weight of him, breathing in the sweet smell of childhood that seemed to cling to all small children. For a moment, the ache in his chest was so sharp he almost gasped. "Could I help grind wheat sometime, Uncle Jake?" Samuel asked, his small face serious with the importance of the question. "I could pour it in the hole where it goes, and watch it come out all white and soft." His enthusiasm was infectious. and Jacob found himself smiling despite the pang of
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
longing that accompanied every interaction with the valley's children. "I think that could be arranged," Jacob said, setting the boy down carefully. "Next time your papa brings wheat to be ground, you come along and I'll show you how it's done." Samuel beamed and ran off to tell his mother about his important new job, leaving Jacob standing beside the mill wheel with his hands suddenly empty and his heart full of bittersweet joy. The afternoon wore on with the steady rhythm of honest work. The men dismantled, cleaned, and reassembled the grinding mechanism while Rose and Mary Hendricks supervised. Samuel and shared the kind of easy conversation that came from years of friendship. Jacob found himself watching Rose interact with the boy, seeing how naturally she guided his endless energy into helpful tasks, how she remembered to praise his small contributions and redirect his attention when he grew restless. "She'd have made a wonderful mother," Mary said quietly, appearing beside Jacob as he took a water break. Her voice held the careful gentleness people used when approaching a subject everyone knew but no one discussed. "Still would if the good Lord saw fit to bless you both." She was a kind woman, Mary Hendricks, the mother of 6 and possessed of the practical wisdom that came from raising children on the frontier. "Rose is wonderful with all your children," Jacob replied, deflecting slightly. Samuel especially seems to have claimed her as his own personal teacher. He watched his wife show the boy how to use a small brush to clean dust from the mill's wooden gears, her patience infinite, her pleasure in his company genuine and unforced. "Children know," Mary said simply. "They can tell who has love to give, and they go toward it like flowers toward sunshine. Rose has enough love stored up to fill this whole valley with children, and they sense it." She paused, studying Jacob's face with the directness of an old friend. "Sometimes I think the Lord's timing isn't the same as ours, Jake. Sometimes what looks like an ending is just a longer beginning than we expected." Before Jacob could respond to Mary's cryptic comment, a commotion erupted from the direction of the mill. Samuel was jumping up and down, pointing excitedly toward the storage room while trying to get the adults' attention with the urgent whispers children used when they'd discovered something important, but weren't sure if they were supposed to tell Mama. "Uncle Jake, come see. There's someone sleeping in the grain room." Samuel's voice carried the mixed excitement and concern of a child who'd stumbled upon something beyond his understanding. "3 someones, and they're really quiet." He tugged on Rose's skirt, his small face serious with the responsibility of his discovery. The adults exchanged glances, suddenly alert. Drifters sometimes sought shelter in barns and outbuildings, especially as autumn nights grew cold, but they usually moved on by morning and rarely traveled in groups. Jacob motioned for the others to stay back while he approached the storage room. Rose closed behind him despite his gesture for her to wait. The storage room was dim and cool, lit only by the light filtering through small windows set high in the stone walls. At first, Jacob saw nothing unusual among the grain sacks and milling equipment. Then Rose pointed toward the far corner, where shadows gathered deepest, and he saw them, 3 children, huddled together behind a stack of wheat sacks like small animals seeking shelter from a storm. They were clearly Native American, with the straight black hair and bronze skin of the Plains tribes, though their clothes were a mixture of traditional and white man's garments. The oldest appeared to be a girl of perhaps 11, with serious, dark eyes that watched the adults with wary intelligence. Beside her crouched a boy of maybe 9, his arm protectively around a smaller girl who couldn't have been more than 7. They were too thin with the hollow-cheeked look of children who'd known real hunger. Their clothes were clean, but worn, mended in multiple places with careful stitches that spoke of someone who'd cared for them, at least until recently. Most telling of all, they showed no fear at being discovered, only a resigned wariness that suggested they'd learned not to expect kindness from the adult world. "It's all right," Rose said softly. stepping forward with the same gentle movements she'd used to approach a skittish horse. "We're not going to hurt you. Are you hungry?" She spoke in English, though Jacob wondered if they understood. Many of the reservation children spoke their tribal languages primarily, learning English only as necessity demanded. The oldest girl, who Jacob now realized was probably responsible for the other two, straightened slightly and replied in carefully pronounced English. "We did not take anything. We will leave now." Her voice carried a dignity that seemed far too mature for her young face, and Jacob felt something twist in his chest at the formal politeness of her words. "Wait," Rose said quickly, taking another step forward. "Please don't go. You're welcome here, and you look like you could use a good meal." She glanced back at Jacob, her eyes asking a question he answered with a small nod. Behind them, he could hear Mary Hendricks quietly explaining to Samuel that he needed to stay back and let the grown-ups handle this. The three children looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that came from shared hardship. The boy whispered something in what Jacob thought might be Lakota, and the oldest girl shook her head slightly. The youngest child hadn't spoken at all, but pressed closer to her companions with the instinctive trust of someone too young to fully understand their danger. "My name is Rose," his wife continued, her voice warm and non-threatening. "This is my husband Jacob, and we own this mill. What are your names?" She settled onto a grain sack, making herself smaller and less intimidating, and Jacob marveled again at her instinctive understanding of how to reach frightened children. The oldest girl hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of engagement against the reality of their situation. Finally she spoke, her words careful and precise. "I am Mapi. This is Ohanzi, my brother, and Tukawin, my sister. We are traveling to find our grandmother's people, but the way is longer than we expected." The formality of her introduction carried echoes of traditional courtesy, and Jacob realized these children had been raised with strong cultural values despite their current circumstances. "That's a long journey for children to make alone," Jacob said gently, speaking for the first time. "How long have you been traveling?" He kept his voice calm and matter-of-fact, the tone he'd used to discuss the weather or the price of cattle. Behind him, he was aware of Bill Hendricks and the other men maintaining a respectful distance while Mary kept young Samuel occupied. Mapi's composure cracked slightly at Jacob's question, and for a moment she looked like exactly what she was, a frightened child trying to be brave for smaller children who depended on her. "Many days," she said finally. "We have been walking since the moon was full." She gestured toward little Takowin, who Jacob now noticed was favoring one foot. "My sister is tired and her foot hurts, but we must keep going." Rose was already moving, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "Let me look at that foot, sweetheart," she said to Takowin, her voice carrying the gentle authority that all children seem to recognize and trust. "I used to be a teacher, and I learned how to help with hurt places." She pulled out the clean handkerchief she always carried, along with a small bottle of water from her lunch basket. Takawin looked to Mapi for permission, and the older girl nodded reluctantly. The little one's foot was badly blistered, Jacob could see, wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been part of someone's shirt. Rose cleaned the wounds with gentle efficiency, her movements sure and practiced, while Mapi and Ohanzi watched with the intense attention of children who'd learned that adult actions often determine their fate. "These need proper tending," Rose said, looking up at Jacob with determination he recognized. "And these children need food and rest before they take another step anywhere." She turned back to Mapi. "I know you're worried about trusting strangers, but I promise you're safe here. At least for tonight." Her voice carried absolute conviction, and Jacob felt his heart swell with pride at her immediate, instinctive compassion. The work on the mill was forgotten as the entire group focused on the three unexpected visitors. Mary Hendricks proved as practical as always, producing additional food from her seemingly bottomless lunch basket while Bill and his boys maintained their distance but stood ready to help if needed. Jacob found himself studying the children's faces, seeing intelligence and strength beneath their wariness, and feeling something he hadn't experienced in 20 years of marriage, the fierce protectiveness of an adult for children who desperately needed protection. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the immediate crisis of hunger and injury was addressed, Jacob began to understand that this was no ordinary encounter. These 3 children had appeared in his mill like an answer to prayers he'd stopped praying, carrying their own sorrows and strengths, their own story that was only beginning to unfold. Rose caught his eye across the storage room where they'd set up an impromptu camp, and in her expression he saw the same recognition, the same impossible hope beginning to bloom despite every reason to guard their hearts. The mill wheel continued its eternal turning outside, powered by water that never stopped flowing, grinding grain into flour that would feed the valley through another winter. But inside the stone walls, something else was beginning, a story that would test everything Jacob and Rose thought they knew about family, faith, and the mysterious ways that prayers sometimes found their answers in the most unexpected places. The Coleman ranch house had never held 3 Native American children before, and as evening settled over the Montana grassland, Jacob found himself acutely aware of how the simple act of hospitality had transformed his familiar home into something entirely new. Rose had settled Maipi, Ohanzi, and Takowin in the spare bedroom upstairs, the room they'd always kept ready for the children who never came, and the sound of young voices drifting down through the floorboards created a music Jacob hadn't realized he'd been desperate to hear. Rose moved through her evening routine with renewed purpose, heating water for baths and gathering clean clothes that might fit the children. She'd found some of her old teaching dresses in the cedar chest, garments she'd saved thinking they might someday be cut down for daughters of her own. Now she worked at the kitchen table with scissors and thread, her hands sure and swift as she altered the fabric to fit 3 unexpected guests who might disappear as suddenly as they'd appeared. The girl, Moppy, she's been carrying responsibility no child should bear, Rose said quietly as she worked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Did you see how she positioned herself between us and the younger ones? How she answered every question like she was negotiating a treaty. Jacob nodded, remembering the careful dignity in the 11-year-old's manner, the way she'd maintained formal politeness even while accepting their help. Through the ceiling, they could hear the murmur of voices speaking in what Jacob assumed was Lakota, punctuated occasionally by Tokowin's lighter tones and what might have been Ohanzi's quiet laughter. The sounds were foreign yet somehow familiar, carrying the same rhythms of family conversation he'd heard in neighbors' homes filled with children. For the first time in decades, the Coleman house felt truly alive. Jacob stood at the kitchen window, watching the last light fade from the western sky, while his mind churned with questions he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Where had these children come from? What circumstances had driven them to travel alone across territory that could be dangerous even for grown men? And perhaps most troubling, who might be looking for them, and with what intentions? The reservation at Little Bighorn was nearly 200 miles to the southeast, but there were smaller communities scattered throughout the territory, and the political situation remained tense even more than a decade after Custer's defeat. The federal government's policies toward native populations changed with each administration, and Jacob had heard disturbing reports of children being forcibly removed from their families for placement in distant boarding schools designed to civilize them by erasing their cultural identity. Jake? Rose's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. You're doing that thing again, where you try to solve all the world's problems before breakfast. She'd finished her alterations and was folding the small garments with the careful attention she'd once given to lesson plans. Whatever brought these children to our mill, they're here now, and they're safe. That's what matters tonight. Before Jacob could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced Moppy's approach. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with the same careful posture she'd maintained all afternoon. Though Jacob noticed she'd accepted Rose's offer of a borrowed nightgown, and her long black hair was still damp from washing. Despite her young age, she carried herself with a composure that spoke of premature responsibility. "Mrs. Coleman," Mapi said formally, "I wanted to thank you for your kindness. Ohanzi and Taka-Win are sleeping, but I thought I should speak with you about our situation." She glanced between Jacob and Rose, clearly steeling herself for a difficult conversation. "We cannot stay long. We have family obligations that require us to continue our journey." Rose gestured to a chair at the kitchen table, her movements gentle but firm. "Sit with us for a while, Mapi. You've been taking care of everyone else all day. Let someone take care of you for a few minutes." She poured a cup of warm milk and set it before the girl, along with a plate of the molasses cookies she'd baked that afternoon. "You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to, but if talking would help, we're good listeners." Mapi accepted the milk but held it without drinking, her dark eyes studying both adults as if trying to determine how much truth they could handle. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Our parents died in the spotted sickness 2 winters ago. We lived with our grandmother after that, but she became ill and passed to the spirit world at the end of summer." Jacob felt his chest tighten at the matter-of-fact way she described such devastating losses. "That's a lot of grief for young people to carry," Rose said softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you've lost so many people you loved." She reached across the table and briefly covered Mapi's small hand with her own, a gesture of comfort that the girl accepted without pulling away. "Where were you living with your grandmother?" "At the agency school," Mapi replied, and Jacob caught the slight tightening around her eyes at the mention. "Grandmother worked in the kitchens there. She said it was better for us to learn the white man's ways, that it would help us survive in the changing world." She paused, taking a small sip of milk. "But after she died, the school officials said we would be transferred to a boarding school in the east, far from our people and our land." The implications hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd heard stories about the government boarding schools institutions, designed to strip native children of their languages, religions, and cultural identities through harsh discipline and forced assimilation. The motto of the Carlisle Industrial School, the most famous of these institutions, was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and reports suggested that many children who entered such schools never returned home. "So you ran away," Rose said, understanding, flooding her voice. "You took your brother and sister and left to find your grandmother's people." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, and Mapi nodded gravely. "That was very brave, Mapi, but also very dangerous. How did you manage to travel so far?" For the first time, Mapi's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frightened child beneath her mature exterior. "Grandmother told me stories about her family, the band that followed Chief Standing Bear when he led his people back to their homeland. She said they lived in the valley where 3 rivers meet, near the mountains that look like sleeping buffalo." Her voice grew smaller as she continued. "I thought I could find them, that they would take us in because we are family." Jacob's knowledge of regional geography told him that Mapi was describing an area at least 300 miles northwest of their current location, through territory that included mountain passes which would be impassable within weeks as winter approached. The fact that 3 children had made it even this far on foot was nothing short of miraculous. "Mapi," Jacob said gently, "that's a long journey, especially with winter coming. Have you considered that your grandmother's people might not still be in the same place? Bands move with the seasons, and a lot has changed in the territory over the past few years." He tried to keep his voice neutral, not wanting to destroy her hope while helping her understand the realities they faced. The girl's jaw tightened with determination that reminded Jacob of his own stubbornness at her age. "I know the journey is difficult, Mr. Coleman, but we cannot go to the boarding school. Grandmother made me promise to keep Ohanzi and Takawin with our people, to make sure they learn our language and our ways. If we are separated and sent east, we will lose everything that makes us who we are." Rose and Jacob exchanged a long look across the table, years of marriage allowing them to communicate without words. In Mapi's fierce determination to protect her younger siblings, they saw echoes of their own protective instincts, the same drive that had led them to open their home to 3 stranger children without hesitation. But they also understood the impossible situation these children faced, caught between a government that wanted to erase their identity and a search for family that might end in disappointment or death. "What if," Rose said carefully, "you stayed here while we helped you find your grandmother's people?" Jake knows this territory better than most, and he has connections with traders and travelers who might have information about the band you're looking for. She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the gentle persuasion she'd once used to coax reluctant students into learning. "You could rest and recover your strength. Let Takawin's foot heal properly while we make inquiries." Mapi's eyes narrowed with suspicion that seemed far too worldly for an 11-year-old. "Why would you help us? We are not your people, and helping us could bring trouble from the agency officials." Her question carried the hard-earned wisdom of a child who'd learned that adult kindness often came with hidden costs. Jacob leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. He thought about his grandfather, who'd built the mill to serve anyone who needed grain ground, regardless of their race or circumstances. He thought about the prayers he and Rose had offered for 20 years, asking for children to love, and the 3 young faces now sleeping under his roof. Most of all, he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be when faced with a choice between safety and righteousness. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who'd found his moral center. "Because you're children who need help, and Rose and I have been blessed with the ability to provide it. And because," he paused, glancing at his wife, "sometimes helping others is how we help ourselves become the people we're meant to be." Mapi studied his face with an intensity that made Jacob feel like she was reading his soul. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. "Grandmother always said that good people exist in all nations, but they are sometimes hard to recognize until you see their actions." She took another sip of milk, and Jacob noticed her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since they'd found her. "If you are willing to help us find our family, we will stay until the search is complete." The simple agreement felt like a momentous decision, though Jacob suspected none of them fully understood its implications yet. Rose smiled with genuine warmth, already mentally planning improvements to their temporary living arrangements. "Tomorrow we'll get you all some proper clothes, and see about finding a tutor to help with your studies while you're here. Education is important, no matter what path your life takes. I can read and write English, and do arithmetic," Mapi said with quiet pride. "Grandmother made sure we learned, even though some people at the agency said book learning was wasted. On Indian children. Ohanzi is learning too, but Takawin is still young." She hesitated, then added, "We also speak our grandmother's language and know the stories and songs she taught us." She said both kinds of knowledge would make us strong. Jacob felt a deep respect for the grandmother who'd raised these children with such wisdom, understanding that survival in a changing world required both adaptation and cultural preservation. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman," he said. "We'd be honored to hear some of those stories while you're here, if you're willing to share them." The evening stretched on with the comfortable rhythm of family conversation, though all 3 adults were acutely aware of the unprecedented nature of their situation. Mapi gradually relaxed as she shared carefully edited versions of their recent experiences, describing nights spent sleeping in abandoned buildings and days walking through territory where they had to avoid both white settlements and military patrols. Her matter-of-fact recounting of hardships that would have broken many adults only increased Jacob's admiration for her strength. When Moppy finally returned upstairs to check on her siblings, Rose began planning aloud for the practical challenges ahead. "We'll need to be careful about how we present this to the neighbors," she said, clearing the dishes from their late evening conversation. "People are still nervous about Indian troubles, even though there hasn't been real conflict in this area for years. Some folks might not understand why we're helping." Jacob nodded, already considering which neighbors could be trusted with the truth and which might need more careful handling. "Bill Hendricks saw them today, and Mary's got a good heart. I think they'll keep quiet if we ask them to. As for the others, we'll just say we're helping some children find their family," which is true enough. As they prepared for bed, both Rose and Jacob moved with the heightened awareness that came from having children in the house. Rose checked the fire in the kitchen stove to ensure it would burn safely through the night, while Jacob secured the doors and windows with more attention than usual. For the first time in their marriage, they had precious lives other than their own to protect. Lying in their bed with the autumn wind whistling around the eaves, Jacob stared at the ceiling and listened to the subtle sounds of a house inhabited by children, the creak of floorboards as someone stirred in sleep, the whisper of voices as siblings comforted each other through dreams. Rose curled against his side with a contentment he hadn't felt from her in years. "Jake," she whispered into the darkness, "do you think we're being foolish? Taking in children who don't belong to us, making promises we might not be able to keep?" Her voice carried vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show, the fear of hope that had learned to protect itself through years of disappointment. Jacob wrapped his arm around her more tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I think," he said slowly, "that for the first time in 20 years, this house feels like a home instead of just a place where two people live." He paused, listening to the profound silence that had been their constant companion for so long. "Maybe those children don't belong to us yet, Rose, but maybe we belong to them, outside." The mill wheel continued its eternal turning, powered by water that flowed regardless of human plans or fears. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the beginning of a search that might lead anywhere. But tonight, 3 children slept safely under a roof that had waited 2 decades to shelter young dreams, while 2 adults discovered that love didn't always arrive in the form you expected. Sometimes it came as responsibility freely chosen, as the courage to risk your heart for strangers who desperately needed to become family. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Coleman Ranch, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber that stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. Jacob woke to a sound he'd never heard in his own home, children's laughter echoing from the kitchen below, mixed with Rose's voice as she guided them through the morning routine of a family. For a moment, he lay still in bed, letting the unfamiliar music wash over him like a prayer finally answered. Downstairs, he found organized chaos that spoke of Rose's teaching experience, adapting to domestic challenges. Moppy stood at the stove under Rose's careful supervision, learning to flip pancakes while Ohansi set the table with the concentrated precision of a 9-year-old determined to prove his usefulness. Tunkowin sat in a chair with her injured foot elevated, but her hands were busy shelling walnuts for the pancake batter, her small fingers working with surprising dexterity. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," Moppy said formally, though Jacob caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd braided her long black hair in a complex pattern he didn't recognize, and the borrowed dress Rose had altered for her fit as if it had been made for her small frame. "Mrs. Coleman is teaching us to make breakfast the way white families do it, and they're teaching me some things too," Rose added, flipping a perfect golden pancake onto the growing stack. "Did you know that walnuts and maple syrup taste even better when you add just a tiny bit of wild mint?" Moppy showed me how her grandmother used to prepare them. Her face glowed with the satisfaction of learning something new, and Jacob realized how much she'd missed having students to teach and be taught by. The morning routine established a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous, the careful dance of a family getting ready for the day, with Rose assigning gentle tasks that made each child feel needed while Jacob planned the practical challenges ahead. Over breakfast, he studied their 3 unexpected guests with new eyes, seeing past their initial wariness to the intelligent, resilient young people they were becoming as safety allowed their true personalities to emerge. Ohanzi, he noticed, had a gift for observation that rivaled any scout Jacob had known, commenting on the behavior of birds outside the window and predicting weather changes with uncanny accuracy. Taco Win possessed an artistic soul that expressed itself in the careful way she arranged food on her plate and the small drawings she made with her finger in spilled flour. And Moppy carried herself with a natural leadership that reminded Jacob of the finest military officers he'd served with during his brief stint in the territorial militia. "I need to ride to town today," Jacob announced as they finished eating, "to send some telegrams and talk to people who might have information about your grandmother's band." He looked directly at Moppy as he spoke, understanding that any decisions would need her approval. "I was thinking Rose could start working with you on lessons while I'm gone. Help you catch up on any schooling you might have missed." Moppy's expression tightened slightly at the mention of lessons, and Jacob realized he'd touched on something sensitive. "What kind of lessons, Mr. Coleman?" "At the agency school, they forbade us to speak our language or practice our customs. They said we had to forget the old ways to become civilized." Her voice carried bitter memory, and Jacob felt anger rise in his chest at the casual cruelty she described. Rose reached across the table and took Moppy's hand gently. "The kind of lessons that add to what you already know, not the kind that try to take it away," she said firmly. "Reading and writing and arithmetic, yes, but also art and music and history, including the history of your own people, if you'd like to share it with us." Her voice carried the passion that had made her beloved by students throughout the territory. The relief in Moppy's eyes was profound, and Jacob realized how much courage it had taken for her to trust them even this far. "Grandmother always said that knowledge is like water. The more sources you drink from, the stronger you become. She wanted us to learn everything we could, from everyone we could." She glanced at her younger siblings who were listening intently despite their apparent focus on finishing breakfast. "We would be honored to learn with Mrs. Coleman." Jacob's ride to Billings took him through familiar territory, transformed by autumn's arrival, the cottonwoods along the creek turning golden while the grassland prepared for winter's sleep. But his mind was occupied with the delicate inquiries he needed to make, how to gather information about a displaced Lakota band without attracting unwanted attention from territorial officials who might have their own interest in locating 3 missing children. The town of Billings bustled with the activity of a frontier community preparing for winter. Freight wagons bringing supplies from the east while cattle drives moved herds to market before the snows came. Jacob tied his horse outside Hutchinson's general store, where proprietor Samuel Hutchinson had served as an unofficial information center for the territory since before Jacob was born. If anyone would know about native movements or family connections, it would be Sam, Jake Coleman. Sam called out as the bell above the door announced Jacob's arrival. "Haven't seen you in town for weeks. How's that pretty wife of yours? And how's the mill holding up?" The portly storekeeper emerged from behind his counter with the enthusiasm he showed for all his customers, particularly those who'd been doing business with him for decades. "Rose as well, and the mill's running fine," Jacob replied, accepting Sam's firm handshake. "Actually, Sam, I'm hoping you might help me with some information. I'm trying to locate a Lakota band that might be in the area family group led by someone related to Chief Standing Bear's people." He kept his voice casual, as if the inquiry was merely academic. Sam's expression grew more serious, and he glanced around the store to ensure they weren't overheard. "That's a delicate question these days, Jake. Government's been moving tribes around like checkers pieces, and some bands that don't want to be moved have taken to avoiding official notice." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Might I ask why you need to find them? Jacob had prepared for this question, crafting an answer that was truthful without being complete. Got some children staying with us, temporarily orphans looking for family connections. Promised I'd help them search, but I want to make sure any contact I make is safe for everyone involved. He met Sam's eyes steadily, allowing his sincerity to speak for itself. The storekeeper nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. There's a trader named Jonas Whitehawk comes through here, regular half crow, half white, knows every tribe. And banned from here to the Canadian border. He was in last week, mentioned some Standing Bear descendants had set up winter camp about 60 miles northwest, in the valley near Beartooth Creek. Sam paused, studying Jacob's face. But Jake, if you're planning to take children into that country, you better know it's not all friendly territory. What kind of unfriendly? Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The territorial government's policies toward native populations had created a complex web of tensions, with some groups accepting reservation life while others maintained their traditional nomadic patterns despite official disapproval. Military's been pressuring all the free bands to report to agencies, Sam explained, his voice dropping even lower. Captain Morrison at Fort Keogh has orders to round up any Indians found off reservation land, especially children of school age. Word is they're being particularly aggressive about enforcing the education policies. The implications hit Jacob like a cold wind, and he understood that his 3 young guests represented exactly the kind of situation that could attract dangerous official attention. Jacob spent the rest of the morning gathering information from other sources, the telegraph operator who relayed messages throughout the territory, the freight company dispatcher who tracked movements along the major trails, and the hotel clerk who registered travelers from across the region. Each conversation added pieces to a complex puzzle that painted a troubling picture of increasing government pressure on native populations and growing tensions over the forced education policies. The ride home gave Jacob time to process what he'd learned and consider the difficult choices ahead. Finding Mapey's grandmother's people was possible, but reaching them would require traveling through territory where military patrols were actively seeking unregistered Native Americans. Keeping the children at the ranch was safer in the short term, but every day increased the risk that someone would ask uncomfortable questions about their presence. He arrived at the ranch to find the afternoon lessons in full swing on the front porch, where Rose had set up an outdoor classroom that took advantage of the warm autumn sunshine. Moppy and Ohanzi bent over slates practicing penmanship while Taco Win worked with colored pencils Rose had found somewhere, creating an elaborate drawing that appeared to tell a story in pictures. How did the artist lessons go? Jacob asked, settling into his usual chair to watch the scholarly activity. Rose looked up from Ohanzi's slate with satisfaction evident on her face, and Jacob could see that teaching again had restored something vital in her spirit that he hadn't realized was missing. Wonderfully, Rose replied, moving to stand behind Win to admire her artwork. Moppy writes better than some of my former students who were twice her age, and Ohanzi has a mathematical mind that could take him anywhere he wants to go. And Taco Win, she paused to ruffle the little girl's hair affectionately, is telling me the story of how the earth was made, complete with illustrations. Taco Win looked up from her drawing with the serious expression she wore when discussing important matters. Grandmother told us this story many times, but I wanted to draw it so I wouldn't forget the details. Mrs. Coleman said that pictures can help preserve memories, just like writing can. She held up her work, revealing a surprisingly sophisticated narrative sequence that showed the creation of land animals and people through the actions of various spirits. Jacob studied the child's artwork with growing amazement, recognizing artistic talent that deserved nurturing regardless of her cultural background. That's beautiful, Tekowin. Your grandmother must have been a wonderful storyteller to help you remember so many details. He glanced at Rose, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. These children possessed gifts that could flourish given the right opportunities. As the afternoon progressed, Jacob shared his findings from town carefully, emphasizing the positive news about locating the band while downplaying the potential dangers involved in reaching them. Moppy listened with the intense attention she brought to everything important, asking intelligent questions about distances, terrain, and the best time of year for such a journey. Winter will make travel difficult, she acknowledged after Jacob described the location Jonas Whitehawk had mentioned. But if we wait until spring, the authorities might find us here and force us back to the agency. Her matter-of-fact assessment of their situation impressed Jacob with its realism, though he hated that an 11-year-old had to think in such terms. There might be another option, Rose said quietly, her teacher's mind clearly working through alternatives. What if we sent word to your grandmother's people through this traitor, Jonas Whitehawk? Let them know you're here and safe. See if they want to establish contact before any decisions about travel are made. Her suggestion carried the wisdom of someone who understood that information could be more valuable than immediate action. The idea sparked animated discussion among the three siblings, with Moppy translating key points into Lakota for the younger children while they debated options in rapid exchanges that reminded Jacob how isolated they'd been from their own cultural community. Watching them communicate in their ancestral language brought home the magnitude of what the boarding schools were designed to destroy, not just individuals, but entire ways of thinking and being. Evening brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Bill Hendricks, who rode up to the house just as Rose was calling everyone in for supper. Jacob met him at the gate, noting the serious expression on his neighbor's weathered face that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Jake, I need to talk to you about those Indian children," Bill said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of difficult news. "Had a visit today from some men asking questions, said they were from the agency, looking for 3 runaway students who'd been reported missing." He glanced toward the house where lamplight in the windows created a warm glow that spoke of family gatherings and evening meals. Jacob felt his blood run cold, though he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of questions, Bill? And what did you tell them?" He was grateful for years of poker games that had taught him to control his reactions under pressure, though his mind raced through the implications of official attention turning their direction. Asked if I'd seen any Indian children in the area. Described 3 kids that sounded exactly like the ones Mary and I met at your mill yesterday. Bill continued, his own discomfort evident in the way he avoided Jacob's eyes. "I told them I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. But Jake," he looked up directly, "they're planning to search every ranch and homestead in the valley. They'll be here within a day or 2. The weight of the situation settled on Jacob's shoulders like a physical burden, and he understood that their peaceful interlude was about to end whether they were ready or not. Inside the house, he could hear Rose's voice guiding the children through evening chores, their laughter mixing with the domestic sounds of a family preparing for another night together. In less than 48 hours, that harmony might be shattered by forces beyond their control. "Bill," Jacob said carefully, "I need you to know that those children aren't criminals or troublemakers. They're orphans trying to find family, and they've got every right to seek their own people." He met his neighbor's eyes steadily, asking for understanding without demanding it. What happens next might depend on whether folks around here believe children deserve protection, or whether they think government officials always know what's best. Bill Hendricks had been Jacob's neighbor for 15 years, through good times and bad, droughts and abundant harvests, celebrations and sorrows. Now he stood silent for a long moment, weighing loyalties and consequences with the careful consideration of a man who understood that some decisions carried weight beyond their immediate effects. "Those agency men," Bill said finally, "they had a look about them I didn't much like. Talked about those children like they were livestock that had wandered off from where they belonged." He straightened in his saddle, decision made. "If anyone asks me again, I still haven't seen anything. That needs reporting. But Jake, you better have a plan. because they're not going to give up easy. As Bill rode away into the gathering darkness, Jacob stood in his yard looking up at the stars that had witnessed countless human struggles across this vast territory. Tomorrow would bring challenges that could test everything he and Rose had built together. Decisions that would determine the fate of 3 children who'd trusted them with their lives. Inside his house, the sounds of family life continued: bedtime stories and gentle corrections, small arguments over who got the last piece of cornbread, and quiet discussions about lessons planned for the next day. But the clock was ticking, now measured not in the comfortable rhythm of seasonal change, but in the urgent drumbeat of official pursuit. Whatever choices lay ahead would have to be made quickly, and Jacob found himself praying to the same God who'd remained silent for 20 years of requests for children, asking now for the wisdom to protect the young lives that had finally arrived. At his door, the morning sky carried the metallic taste of approaching snow, and Jacob Coleman stood at his bedroom window watching the horizon for dust clouds that might herald unwanted visitors. Below in the kitchen, Rose moved through breakfast preparations with deliberate calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders as she glanced repeatedly toward the stairs where 3 children still slept, unaware that their fragile sanctuary was about to be tested. Jacob had spent most of the night wrestling with impossible choices, each option carrying risks that could destroy the tentative family they'd begun to build. Running would brand them all as fugitives and guarantee pursuit across territory where winter was fast approaching. Staying meant facing federal agents with legal authority and no understanding of the human cost of their bureaucratic mandates. Either path could end with Moppy, Ohanzi, and Takawin torn from the only safety they'd known since their grandmother's death. The sound of horses approaching from the east brought Jacob's anxious vigil to an end sooner than expected. Through the morning mist, he counted 5 riders moving with the purposeful pace of men on official business, their dark coats and military bearing unmistakable even at distance. Jacob's chest tightened as he recognized the lead rider captain, Marcus Brennan from Fort Keogh, a man whose reputation for rigid enforcement of federal policies had earned him fear rather than respect throughout the territory. "Rose," Jacob called quietly down the stairs, keeping his voice level despite the urgency pounding in his chest. "We have company coming. Federal agents by the look of them." He heard her sharp intake of breath, followed by the deliberate sounds of someone setting down kitchen implements with careful control. "I'm going to meet them outside. Keep the children upstairs until we know what we're dealing with." Jacob stepped onto his front porch just as the 5 riders reached his gate, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold morning air. Captain Brennan dismounted with the fluid motion of a career cavalryman, his steel-gray eyes already studying the ranch buildings with the systematic attention of someone conducting a search. Behind him, 2 agency officials in civilian clothes, flanked by a pair of armed soldiers, completed a formation designed to project both authority and potential force. "Mr. Coleman," Brennan said without preamble, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm Captain Brennan, Fort Keogh. These gentlemen are Agent Patterson and Agent Morse from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're conducting a search for 3 Native American children who escaped from federal custody 6 weeks ago." He paused, studying Jacob's face with the practiced assessment of an interrogator. "We have reports that such children may have been seen in this area." Jacob kept his expression neutral, drawing on years of poker games and business negotiations. That had taught him to reveal nothing until he understood all the stakes involved. "Good morning, Captain. I'm always willing to cooperate with federal authorities, though I'm not sure what help I can provide. What exactly are you looking for?" His tone remained respectful while offering no information beyond what was directly requested. Agent Patterson stepped forward, consulting a leather-bound notebook with the bureaucratic precision that Jacob had learned to distrust. 3 children, ages approximately 7 to 11, who were removed from their assigned educational placement without authorization. The eldest is a girl named Maypee, or some similar Indian designation, traveling with 2 younger siblings. He looked up from his notes with cold efficiency. They're considered wards of the federal government, and harboring them constitutes interference with lawful custody. The casual mispronunciation of Mapee's name and the dismissive reference to some similar Indian designation sparked anger in Jacob's chest that he fought to control. These men spoke of 3 frightened orphans as if they were escaped livestock, showing no recognition of their humanity or the circumstances that had driven them to flee supposed protection. That's a serious allegation, Agent Patterson. Are you suggesting someone in this area has broken federal law? Captain Brennan's hand rested casually on his sidearm as he surveyed the ranch buildings with predatory interest. We're suggesting that good-hearted folks sometimes make poor decisions when they encounter children who claim to need help. These particular children are skilled at manipulating sympathetic adults, spinning stories designed to gain unauthorized assistance. His implication was clear. Anyone who helped the children was being deceived rather than performing a moral duty. I see, Jacob replied, his voice carefully neutral despite the rage building behind his calm exterior. And what would happen to these children if they were located? I assume they'd be returned to their educational placement? He kept his tone conversational, as if discussing livestock management rather than the fate of 3 young lives. Agent Morse spoke for the first time, his nasal voice carrying the self-righteousness of someone convinced of his civilizing mission. The Carlisle Industrial School has generously agreed to accept all 3, despite their flight risk. It's a tremendous opportunity for these children to receive proper education and preparation for productive lives in American society. He smiled with the smug satisfaction of someone describing a great favor rather than cultural destruction. Jacob's knowledge of Carlisle's reputation made his stomach turn. The Pennsylvania institution was infamous for its harsh methods of forced assimilation, where native children were forbidden their languages, religions, and cultural practices under threat of severe punishment. Students who entered often emerged as strangers to their own families, unable to function in either white or native society. The thought of Mapee, Ohanzi, and Takowin subjected to such treatment filled him with protective fury. That does sound like an opportunity, Jacob said, the words bitter in his mouth. I'm sure any children in that situation would be grateful for such attention from the federal government. His sarcasm was barely concealed, but the agents seemed to take his words at face value, their bureaucratic certainty blinding them to his actual meaning. Captain Brennan stepped closer to the porch, his military bearing designed to intimidate. Mr. Coleman, we'll need to search your property as part of our investigation. I'm sure you understand that thoroughness is required when dealing with federal fugitives. The word fugitives applied to 3 orphan children struck Jacob as obscene, but he maintained his composed exterior while his mind raced through options. Of course, Captain. I have nothing to hide, Jacob replied, stepping aside to allow access to his porch while silently praying that Rose had managed to keep the children hidden. Though I should mention that my wife is recovering from illness and would prefer not to be disturbed unnecessarily. The lie came easily, providing cover for Rose's need to protect their unexpected guests without arousing additional suspicion. The search began with systematic efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. Agent Patterson examined the main house while Agent Morse inspected the outbuildings, their movements methodical and invasive. Captain Brennan remained near Jacob, ostensibly to ask questions, but clearly to prevent any communication that might warn potential fugitives. The 2 soldiers positioned themselves strategically to cover all exits from the ranch complex. From inside the house came the sounds of a thorough search, furniture being moved, doors opening and closing, footsteps on stairs, as Patterson investigated every possible hiding place. Jacob forced himself to remain calm while listening to strangers violate the privacy of his home, searching for 3 children whose only crime was wanting to remain with their own people rather than submit to cultural obliteration. Nice spread you have here, Coleman, Brennan commented, his tone conversational but his eyes constantly scanning for signs of deception. Must take considerable work to maintain all this. Hard to imagine you'd risk it all for the sake of some Indian runaways who mean nothing to you. His words carried subtle threat, suggesting that harboring the children would result in consequences extending far beyond their removal. Jacob met the captain's gaze steadily, understanding the game being played. My wife and I have always believed in helping those who need it, Captain. But we're also law-abiding citizens who understand our obligations. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Of course, we'd want to be certain that any children we encountered were actually receiving help rather than harm from their return to federal custody. The subtle challenge in Jacob's words caused Brennan's eyes to narrow with suspicion. Are you questioning federal policy regarding Indian education, Mr. Coleman? Because that would suggest sympathies that might interfere with your civic duties. The threat was becoming more explicit, and Jacob realized that his attempt to probe their intentions had revealed too much of his own position. Before Jacob could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the tense conversation. A new group of riders crested the hill to the east, Bill Hendricks leading what appeared to be half the ranchers in the valley, their faces grim with determination that spoke of serious purpose. Jacob felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension as he recognized men who'd been his neighbors for decades, their presence suggesting support he hadn't dared expect. Bill Hendricks dismounted near the gate and approached with the deliberate confidence of a man backed by community support. "Morning, Jake. Heard you had some visitors asking questions about missing children." He nodded respectfully to Captain Brennan while his eyes conveyed sympathy and solidarity to Jacob. "Thought we should clarify a few things about how things work in this valley." Captain Brennan's expression hardened at this unexpected development, clearly recognizing that his position of authority had suddenly become more complicated. "Mr. Hendricks, I presume? This is federal business, not a matter for local interference." His hand moved closer to his weapon, but the presence of a dozen armed ranchers made any show of force impractical. "No interference intended, Captain," Bill replied with deceptive mildness. "Just want to make sure everyone understands the situation clearly. See, we've all heard stories about children being taken from families and shipped off to schools where they disappear or come back broken." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone speaking for his community. "Folks around here tend to take a dim view of that kind of thing." Agent Patterson emerged from the house at that moment, his frustrated expression indicating an unsuccessful search. "No sign of anyone upstairs, Captain. Wife claims to be ill, stayed in bed during the entire inspection." He glanced nervously at the assembled ranchers, clearly uncomfortable with the deteriorating tactical situation. "Perhaps we should continue our search elsewhere." The standoff stretched taut with unspoken tensions as both sides assessed their positions. Jacob understood that his neighbors had taken enormous risks by openly opposing federal agents, potentially exposing themselves to the same threats he faced. But their presence had created space for negotiation that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and he felt gratitude that went beyond words. "Captain Brennan," Jacob said carefully, "I understand you have a job to do, and I respect federal authority. But these men represent families who've lived in this territory for generations, and they're asking for assurance that any children involved in this situation will be treated with appropriate care." He gestured toward the assembled ranchers. "Perhaps there's a way to address everyone's concerns." Brennan's jaw tightened with frustration as he realized that his simple retrieval mission had become a complex political situation. The presence of so many armed locals made enforcement impractical, while his superiors would demand results regardless of obstacles encountered. "Mr. Coleman, if you or anyone else in this valley is harboring federal fugitives, the consequences will be severe. We'll return with additional resources if necessary." The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. And Jacob understood that this confrontation represented only the opening move in a longer struggle. The federal agents possessed legal authority and unlimited resources, while the local community had only moral conviction and mutual support. But as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, men who'd risked their own safety to protect 3 orphaned children they'd never met, Jacob felt a strength he'd never experienced before. Agent Morse climbed back into his saddle with obvious relief, eager to escape a situation that had spiraled beyond his bureaucratic comfort zone. "This matter isn't closed, Coleman. We'll be back with proper authorization and sufficient force to complete our investigation." His words carried the petulant anger of someone whose authority had been questioned, promising future consequences for today's defiance. As the federal agents rode away, their departure created a collective release of tension that left everyone slightly shaken by what they'd just witnessed. Jacob found himself surrounded by neighbors whose support had probably saved 3 children from immediate capture, though everyone understood that the respite would be temporary. The federal government didn't abandon its objectives easily, and their return was inevitable. "Jake," Bill Hendricks said quietly as the group began to disperse, "you need to know that not everyone in the valley will stand with you if this gets worse. Some folks are scared of federal retaliation, and others genuinely believe the government knows best about Indian affairs." His warning carried the weight of political reality, reminding Jacob that community support had limits. Jacob nodded, understanding the precarious nature of his position. "I appreciate what you all did today, Bill, more than you know. But I won't ask anyone to risk their families for my decisions." He looked around at the assembled ranchers, seeing good men who'd already done more than duty required. "Whatever happens next, it's my responsibility to handle." As his neighbors rode away, Jacob turned back toward his house where Rose waited with 3 children, whose fate now hung in the balance between federal authority and individual conscience. The morning's confrontation had bought them time, but it had also escalated a situation that could no longer be resolved through simple concealment. Choices would have to be made, and soon, before winter made travel impossible and federal resources made resistance futile. Inside the house, he found Rose in the kitchen with Moppy, Ohanzi, and Takawin gathered around the table like a family. Council of War. Their faces reflected understanding that went beyond their years, the knowledge that safety was always temporary for people caught between competing powers who cared nothing for their individual humanity. But in their eyes, Jacob also saw trust that he and Rose would find a way to protect them. Faith that good people could overcome systematic cruelty through courage and love. "We heard the voices," Moppy said simply, her 11-year-old dignity intact despite the morning's terror. "We know they came for us, and we know you turned them away." She paused, looking between Jacob and Rose with gratitude that made his chest tight. Grandmother always said that true family protects each other no matter what the cost. "We understand. Now that you are our family, just as we are yours." The simple declaration carried weight that transformed everything Jacob thought he knew about love, responsibility, and the meaning of answered prayers. For 20 years, he and Rose had asked for children to call their own. Now 3 orphan siblings had claimed them as family, offering the same fierce loyalty they'd received, ready to face whatever consequences their bond might bring. The federal agents would return, winter was approaching, and the path ahead remained treacherous and uncertain. But as Jacob looked around his kitchen table at the faces of his unexpected family, he felt something he'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice, that love created obligations stronger than law, and that 3 children sleeping in his mill had brought him not just the family he'd prayed for, but the chance to become the man he was meant to be. 3 days after the federal agent's visit, Jacob Coleman found himself in a place he'd never expected to be, sitting in the back room of McNeil's saloon at midnight, surrounded by men whose faces he recognized but whose secret activities he was only beginning to understand. The amber glow of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on weathered faces as Samuel Hutchinson spread a hand-drawn map across the scarred wooden table, his finger tracing routes that existed nowhere in official territorial surveys. What you're looking at, Jake, is 20 years of quiet work, Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper despite the late hour and empty saloon. Ever since the government started their school programs, there's been folks who believe children belong with their families, not in institutions designed to kill everything that makes them who they are. He pointed to a series of dots connected by meandering lines. Safe houses, hidden trails, people willing to risk everything to help families stay together. Jacob studied the map with growing amazement, recognizing landmarks throughout the territory marked with symbols that indicated allies in a network he'd never suspected existed. Ranchers he'd known for years, merchants he'd traded with, even some reservation agents who'd apparently chosen conscience over career, all connected by invisible threads of resistance to policies they couldn't openly oppose. The underground river, we call it, added Tom Mackenzie, a grizzled freight hauler whose wagons traveled every major trail in Montana territory. Like the old slave routes down south, except we're moving children toward freedom instead of away from bondage. His weathered hands traced alternative paths around military outposts and agency headquarters. Been helping families reunite for more than a decade, though we've had to be more careful since they started treating it as federal crime. The revelation that such an organization existed filled Jacob with hope and terror in equal measure. Hope that Moppy, Ohanzi, and Takowin might have options beyond hiding in his house or surrendering to federal custody. Terror at the implications of joining a conspiracy that could result in prison sentences for everyone involved if discovered. The stakes had escalated far beyond anything he'd imagined when 3 frightened children sought shelter in his mill. "Why are you telling me this, Sam?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "And why now?" Around the table, faces that belonged to respected members of the community watched him with expressions that mixed trust and desperate hope. These weren't radicals or troublemakers, but ordinary people pushed to extraordinary action by witnessing systematic cruelty disguised as government policy. Because those 3 children sleeping in your house represent exactly why this network exists, replied Martha Hendricks, whose presence surprised Jacob, until he remembered that women often proved more committed to protecting children than men were to following unjust laws. And because Captain Brennan filed a report requesting military support for his next visit to your ranch. Word is he's planning to return with enough soldiers to search every building and arrest anyone who interferes. The news hit Jacob like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about federal determination to recover their property regardless of human cost. "How do you know about Brennan's plans?" he asked, though the intricate network represented on the map suggested information sources throughout the territorial government. "My cousin works as a clerk at Fort Keogh," Martha replied with grim satisfaction. "She's been copying documents and passing information for 3 years, ever since her own mixed-blood grandchildren were threatened with removal." Her voice carried the bitter anger of someone who'd watched government policies tear families apart in the name of civilization and progress. Jonas Whitehawk emerged from the shadows near the saloon's back door, his mixed Crow and European heritage allowing him to move between worlds that rarely intersected. Jacob had heard of the traitor, but never met him, though his reputation for honesty and cultural knowledge made him trusted by both native and white communities throughout the region. "I've been in contact with the band you're seeking," Jonas said without preamble, settling into a chair with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in wilderness and civilization. "Standing Bear's descendants are indeed camped near Beartooth Creek, and they're willing to accept the 3 children if safe passage can be arranged." He paused, studying Jacob's face in the lamplight. "But the journey requires crossing territory, where military patrols have increased significantly in recent weeks. The map Jonas unfolded showed terrain that Jacob recognized from hunting trips and cattle drives, but marked now with danger zones and patrol schedules that turned familiar landscape into a strategic challenge. Military outposts, agency checkpoints, and settler communities where federal sympathy ran strong created barriers that would require careful navigation and precise timing to avoid. The traditional route follows the river valleys, Jonas continued, his finger tracing a path that meandered through relatively open country. But Brennan has anticipated that approach and stationed patrols at every major crossing. The alternative requires traveling through mountain passes that will be dangerous once winter weather arrives. He looked directly at Jacob. Either way, the journey must begin within days, before snow closes the high country entirely. Jacob felt the weight of impossible decisions settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Staying meant facing military force that could result in the children's capture and his own imprisonment. Leaving meant trusting their lives to winter mountain travel with federal agents in pursuit. Both options carried risks that could destroy everything he'd tried to protect. "There's a third possibility," Sam Hutchinson said quietly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone proposing something dangerous even by underground river standards. "We've done it twice before when situations became desperate, a coordinated effort involving multiple families and routes that divides federal attention while ensuring at least some children reach safety." He spread additional maps showing the entire territory. "But it requires everyone to accept significant risk." The plan that emerged from the next hour of discussion was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. 7 families with children at risk would leave simultaneously from different locations, following divergent routes toward various destinations while maintaining communication through the underground river network. Federal forces would be forced to split their pursuit efforts while community allies provided misdirection and false information. "The beauty of it," Tom McKenzie explained, "is that even if some families are captured, others will reach safety. And the federal government will face the political nightmare of arresting respected community members for protecting children from what amounts to cultural destruction." His strategic thinking reflected years of experience moving valuable cargo through hostile territory. Jacob listened to the planning with growing appreciation for the courage and organization these ordinary people had developed in response to extraordinary injustice. But he also understood that accepting their help would transform him from someone sheltering 3 orphans into a participant in systematic resistance to federal authority. The decision would affect not only his own fate, but Rosie's future and the lives of everyone in the network. "I need to discuss this with my wife," Jacob said finally, though he suspected Rose's response would reflect the fierce protectiveness she'd already shown toward Moppy, Ohanzi, and Takawin. And with the children themselves, they have the right to understand the risks and help choose their own path. Around the table, heads nodded with respect for his position, though everyone understood that time for deliberation was running short. The ride home through the pre-dawn darkness gave Jacob time to process the evening's revelations and consider how to present impossible choices to a woman who'd already opened her heart completely to 3 children she'd known for less than a week. The underground river represented hope, but hope purchased with risks that could destroy the life he and Rose had built together over 20 years of marriage. He found Rose awake in the kitchen despite the early hour, her hands busy with bread, dough that didn't require kneading at 4 in the morning. She looked up as he entered, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of love and fear that had sustained them through 2 decades of shared challenges. "I've been thinking about that morning when we found them in the mill," Rose said without preamble, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had attracted him from their first meeting. "How they looked like they'd given up hope until we showed them kindness. How quickly they began to trust us, even though trusting adults had probably brought them nothing but disappointment." She shaped the dough with movements that betrayed her emotional state despite her calm words. "Rose," Jacob began, but she continued as if she hadn't heard him speak, her need to express her thoughts overriding conversation protocols they'd followed for decades. I've also been thinking about all those years we prayed for children, and how we never specified that we wanted babies we could raise from birth, she said, her hand stilling on the bread dough. Maybe God was waiting for us to be ready for children who needed parents brave enough to fight for them, not just love them. She looked up at Jacob with eyes that held absolute certainty despite the tears threatening to spill over. The underground river wants to help them reach their grandmother's people, Jacob said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table, where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. But it means joining a conspiracy that could send us both to federal prison if we're caught. It means leaving everything we've built here and starting over somewhere else. If the plan fails, he met her eyes steadily. It means risking our entire future for 3 children who aren't even legally ours. Rose's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying the same determination that had sustained her through years of disappointment and loss. Those children are ours in every way that matters, Jake Coleman. Legal papers didn't make them, family love did. And if loving them means fighting the entire federal government, then that's what we do. She wiped flour from her hands with decisive movements. Tell me about this underground river and what they're proposing. The next 2 hours passed in intense discussion as Jacob shared everything he'd learned about the network's operations, capabilities, and the specific plan being developed for their situation. Rose listened with the analytical mind that had made her an exceptional teacher, asking practical questions about logistics, timing, and backup plans that revealed her complete commitment to protecting their unexpected family. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when they heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by Mapi's appearance in the kitchen doorway. The 11-year-old wore the careful expression she'd maintained since their arrival, but Jacob noticed new lines of worry around her eyes that suggested she'd been awake listening to their conversation. Mrs. Coleman, Mr. Coleman, Mapi said with her characteristic formality, we did not mean to cause such trouble for your family. If our presence is creating danger for you, Ohanzi and Takawin and I can continue our journey alone. Her words carried the devastating dignity of a child offering to sacrifice herself for the adults who'd shown her kindness. Absolutely not, Rose replied with a firmness that surprised even Jacob. You 3 are not causing trouble, Mapi. The trouble is being caused by people who think children are property to be managed rather than human beings with the right to be with their families. She stood and moved to embrace the girl, who accepted the comfort with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been alone too long. Jacob watched his wife hold an 11-year-old Lakota orphan in their kitchen while explaining that some things were worth any risk, and he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a man, a husband, and a father. For 20 years he'd thought God's silence meant rejection. Now he understood it might have meant preparation, waiting until he and Rose were ready to love with the courage that real love required. Mapi, Jacob said gently, we found people who can help you reach your grandmother's band safely. But the journey will be dangerous, and we need you to help us decide whether to attempt it or find another solution. He explained the underground river's proposal in terms she could understand, watching her process the information with the premature wisdom that trauma had forced upon her. The conversation that followed included Ohanzi and Takawin, who appeared in the kitchen, drawn by voices discussing their future. Despite their youth, both children listened with the serious attention of people who'd learned that adult decisions determined their survival. When Jacob finished explaining their options, the silence stretched long enough for the morning sun to paint golden rectangles across the kitchen floor. In our tradition, Mapi said finally, important decisions are made by the whole family, with everyone's voice heard and respected. She looked around the table at faces that had become precious to her in just a few days. If we are truly family now, then we decide together what is best for all of us, not just for Ohanzi and Takawin and me, the simple statement carried weight that transformed the entire discussion. reframing their situation not as adults protecting children, but as a family facing crisis together. Jacob felt tears threaten as he realized that these 3 orphans were offering him and Rose the same fierce loyalty they'd received, choosing to include them in decisions that would determine everyone's future. Outside, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their family council with the harsh reminder that time for discussion was running short. Through the kitchen window, Jacob could see dust clouds that suggested multiple riders moving fast toward the ranch. But instead of the federal agents he'd feared, he recognized Jonas Whitehawk leading a small group that included several people he didn't recognize. "The plan has changed," Jonas announced as he dismounted near the kitchen door. "Military patrols have moved to block the northern routes, and we've received word that Brennan is returning today with enough soldiers to search every building in the valley." His weathered face carried grim urgency that suggested no time for careful deliberation. "If we're going to move these children to safety, it has to be now." The kitchen that had been a place of peaceful family discussion moments before suddenly became a command center as Underground River operatives shared intelligence and coordinated a hasty departure. Jacob watched Rose move with calm efficiency, gathering supplies and warm clothes, while Moppy helped her younger siblings prepare for another journey into uncertainty. But as he looked around at the faces of people risking everything to protect 3 children they barely knew, Jacob felt something he'd never experienced before: the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The federal government might have legal authority and unlimited resources, but the Underground River had something more powerful: the unshakable conviction that families belonged together, and the courage to act on that belief regardless of consequences. The autumn wind carried the scent of snow as Jacob Coleman guided his wagon through terrain that had never appeared on any territorial map. Following trails known only to those who moved between worlds, the government refused to acknowledge. Behind him, Rose sat with Tacklewind curled against her side, while Moppy and Ohanzi maintained the alert silence of children who understood that their lives depended on remaining invisible to the wrong eyes. 3 days of traveling through hidden valleys and forgotten passes had brought them to the threshold of a reunion 20 years in the making. Jonas Whitehawk raised his hand to signal a halt as they crested a ridge overlooking Beartooth Creek, where smoke from cooking fires rose into the crystalline air like prayers made visible. Below them spread a temporary village that seemed to exist in harmony with the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Hide lodges arranged in traditional patterns, horses grazing in carefully tended meadows, and people moving through daily routines that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. "There," Jonas said quietly, pointing toward a cluster of lodges near the creek's bend. "The family you seek has been expecting you for 3 days." Word travels quickly among people who understand the importance of protecting children. His weathered face carried satisfaction, mixed with relief as he guided them down the slope toward a meeting that would either fulfill desperate hopes or create new forms of heartbreak. Jacob felt his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name as they approached the village, acutely aware that he was about to lose the children who had transformed his understanding of love, purpose, and answered prayer. Beside him, Rose's hands gripped the wagon seat with white-knuckled intensity, her face reflecting the same mixture of joy and devastation that threatened to overwhelm his own carefully maintained composure. The village received them with the quiet dignity that marked all important occasions in Lakota culture, though Jacob noticed how quickly word of their arrival spread among the lodges. Children peered from doorways with the universal curiosity of the young, while adults maintained respectful distance that allowed the reunification to proceed without interference. The very air seemed charged with the weight of family obligations being fulfilled. An elderly woman emerged from the largest lodge with movements that spoke of age balanced by inner strength, her weathered face carrying the wisdom that came from surviving decades of cultural upheaval while maintaining essential connections to tradition. She wore a combination of traditional and white clothing that reflected the complexity of existence between two worlds, but her bearing proclaimed identity that no government policy could diminish. Grandmother. Takawin's cry of recognition shattered the formal quiet as she launched herself from the wagon toward the elderly woman, her small body moving with the desperate hunger of a child who had thought herself permanently orphaned. The reunion struck Jacob's heart like a physical blow, especially when he saw tears streaming down the old woman's face as she caught the little girl in arms that had waited too long for this embrace. Mapi and Ohanzi followed with more restraint but equal emotion, their careful composure finally cracking as they realized that their impossible journey had somehow led them home. Jacob watched their grandmother examine each child with the careful attention of someone assessing damage while celebrating survival, her hands moving over faces and limbs as if reassuring herself that they were truly present and unharmed. "My children," the grandmother murmured in accented English, her voice thick with emotion that transcended language barriers. "My heart has been broken since I learned of your escape from the school. Every day I prayed to the spirits to guide you safely home." She looked up at Jacob and Rose with gratitude that made words unnecessary, though she attempted them anyway. "You have brought my family back to me. This debt can never be repaid." Jacob climbed down from the wagon with legs that felt unsteady, overwhelmed by the magnitude of joy and loss warring in his chest. These 3 children had given him and Rose a taste of parenthood they'd craved for 20 years, but their true home lay in the embrace of this grandmother who had never stopped believing in their return. The rightness of the reunion was undeniable, even as it tore his heart in directions he'd never experienced. "There is no debt," Rose said firmly, her teacher's voice carrying across the gathering crowd despite its emotional tremor. "These children gave us far more than we gave them. They taught us what it means to be a family, even if only for a short time." She stepped forward to embrace each child in farewell, her movements careful and deliberate as she tried to memorize sensations she would never experience again. But the grandmother's response surprised everyone present, her words carrying implications that transformed the entire situation in ways Jacob hadn't dared imagine. "Short time, Mrs. Coleman, you misunderstand our ways. These children speak of you as parents who chose them when they had no one else. In our tradition, such bonds create family obligations that extend across lifetimes." Her dark eyes studied both Jacob and Rose with assessment that went beyond mere gratitude. Mapi stepped forward with the dignity she'd maintained throughout their ordeal, her 11-year-old voice carrying authority that commanded attention from everyone present. "Grandmother, Mr. and Mrs. Coleman risked everything to protect us when the government agents came. They joined the underground river and left their home forever to bring us to you safely." She paused, glancing between the adults who had shaped her understanding of love and sacrifice. "They are our parents now, just as you are our grandmother." The cultural implications of Mapi's declaration rippled through the gathering like stones dropped in still water, creating circles of meaning that Jacob was only beginning to understand. Around them, tribal members nodded with approval that suggested such adoptions were not unusual in communities where survival often depended on expanding family connections beyond biological relationships. "This is true," the grandmother said, her voice gaining strength as she processed the full situation. "You have claimed these children as your own through actions that prove your commitment. They have claimed you as parents through choice rather than birth." She gestured toward the village around them. "In our way, this makes you family to all of us. Welcome in our lodges for as long as you choose to stay." The offer struck Jacob like unexpected lightning, illuminating possibilities he'd never considered while solving problems he'd thought insurmountable. Staying with the band would mean abandoning the ranch and mill that represented 20 years of labor, but it would also mean keeping the family they discovered together, while learning about cultures that could enrich their understanding of what it meant to be human. "Grandmother speaks wisdom," added a middle-aged man who approached with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership responsibilities. "I am Standing Wolf, grandson of the chief you seek to honor. These children have told us how you protected them from those who would steal their spirits and sell their bodies to schools that kill everything beautiful in our young people." His English carried formal precision that spoke of education balanced. With cultural pride, Standing Wolf continued with words that carried the weight of official tribal recognition. "Our band has survived by adopting those who prove their worthiness through actions rather than blood. You have proven such worthiness by choosing our children's welfare over your own safety." He gestured toward the lodges around them. "We offer you a place among us, if you can accept a life different from what you have known." Jacob found himself speechless as he processed an offer that would resolve every problem they faced while creating entirely new challenges. Living with the band would protect all of them from federal pursuit while keeping their unexpected family together, but it would require adapting to cultural patterns completely foreign to his white middle-class background. The decision demanded courage of a different sort than anything he'd faced before. Rose stepped forward with the same determination that had sustained her through 20 years of disappointment and loss, her voice carrying absolute certainty despite the magnitude of the choice she was making. "We accept your generous offer, Standing Wolf. These children are our family now, and family stays together regardless of the challenges involved." She looked at Jacob with eyes that asked for confirmation while declaring her own unwavering commitment. "Rose is right," Jacob said, finding his voice despite the emotional storm threatening to overwhelm his composure. "We came here to bring the children home, but we're learning that home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to love and protect." He gestured toward Mapi, Ohanzi, and Takawin, who watched the adult conversation with hopeful attention. "If they'll have us, we'd be honored to become part of your community." The celebration that followed transformed the autumn afternoon into something approaching magic, as cultural barriers dissolved in the face of love that transcended racial and linguistic differences. Jacob found himself learning Lakota phrases while Rose discussed educational traditions with tribal women who understood the importance of preserving knowledge across generational lines. The children moved between languages and customs with the fluid adaptability that made them natural bridges between worlds. As evening approached, the grandmother who insisted Jacob and Rose call her Nokomis, the traditional term for grandmother, shared stories that placed their unexpected family within contexts spanning generations of tribal history. "Our people have always understood that the spirits work through human choices," she explained, her weathered hands weaving meaning from air and firelight. "When children need parents and parents need children, the wise ones listen for opportunities to serve the greater harmony." The stories that emerged around the evening fire revealed the complex history of a people who had survived cultural genocide through adaptation while maintaining essential spiritual connections to ancestral wisdom. Jacob listened with growing appreciation for the sophisticated understanding of family, community, and individual responsibility that governed tribal relationships, recognizing principles that could enrich his own moral development. "Tomorrow we begin the winter migration toward protected valleys where the band has sheltered for generations," Standing Wolf explained as the fire burned low and stars emerged in impossible profusion above their heads. "The journey requires 3 weeks of careful travel, but it leads to places where federal agents fear to venture, and winter provides natural barriers against unwanted visitors." His words carried promise of safety, purchased through knowledge accumulated across centuries of survival. Jacob felt peace settling over him, like a physical presence as he contemplated a future that bore no resemblance to anything he'd previously imagined. The ranch and mill that had defined his identity would pass to other hands, but in exchange he would gain understanding of family bonds that extended beyond individual households to encompass entire communities united by shared values rather than mere geography. Rose sat with Takowin asleep in her lap while Mapi and Ohanzi leaned against her sides. The picture of maternal contentment, that had eluded her for 20 years of marriage. "Jake," she whispered, her voice carrying wonder at the strangeness of divine timing. "Do you remember what I said that first morning about providence? About not turning away answers to prayer, even when they came in unexpected forms?" Her smile reflected firelight and something deeper that spoke of dreams finally fulfilled. "I remember," Jacob replied, his own voice thick with emotions that had no adequate expression in English or Lakota. "I also remember thinking that 3 children sleeping in our mill might be the answer to prayers I'd stopped praying." He looked around at faces illuminated by firelight, his wife, his adopted children, his new extended family, and felt gratitude that encompassed every moment of longing that had led to this impossible resolution. The night deepened around them with the profound silence of wilderness, unmarked by human conflict, while overhead the stars performed their eternal dance above people who had learned to read meaning in celestial movements. Jacob understood that tomorrow would begin a new chapter in a story he could never have written for himself, filled with challenges and discoveries that would test everything he thought he knew about identity, belonging, and the mysterious ways that love created families. From the most unlikely materials, but as he watched his wife hold 3 Lakota children who had somehow become their own, while tribal members who had been strangers that morning shared their fire with the generosity that marked true civilization, Jacob felt certain that some stories were worth every sacrifice required to reach their proper endings. The mill wheel that had turned faithfully for 30 years would find new hands to guide its work, but the love that had waited 2 decades for expression had finally found its perfect purpose. The wind that carried winter's promise also carried smoke from cooking fires that spoke of community survival. Children's laughter that proved joy could emerge from the darkest circumstances, and the quiet conversations of adults who had learned that family meant choosing to love regardless of the costs involved. In the morning, they would begin a journey toward winter refuge that would complete their transformation from desperate refugees into integral members of a community that understood the true meaning of home. As Jacob settled into sleep beside the fire that had welcomed them into their new life, he thought about the prayers he and Rose had offered for 20 years, asking for children to love and guide. The answer had come not as biological offspring, but as 3 orphan souls who had needed parents brave enough to risk everything for their protection. Perhaps that had always been the plan. Perhaps the long wait had been preparation for a love that required courage rather than mere desire. The last thing Jacob heard before sleep claimed him was Tekoan's voice speaking softly in Lakota to the grandmother who had never stopped believing in her return, followed by Rose's gentle English response that proved love needed no translation when expressed through actions that honored the sacred bonds between hearts chosen to beat as one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight their family was complete, gathered around a fire that would burn in memory long after the embers cooled to ash. The Endine, the spring of 1888. Territorial records showed that the Coleman Ranch had been abandoned, its owners having disappeared without explanation during the previous winter. Federal agents continued searching for 3 Lakota children who had vanished from government custody, but no trace was ever found. Local residents spoke occasionally of seeing smoke from distant campfires in the mountains, where no settlements officially existed, and travelers sometimes reported encountering a mixed family that seemed to belong to no single world yet moved comfortably through all of them. The mill wheel continued turning long after new owners claimed the property, powered by water that never stopped flowing, grinding grain that fed the valley while carrying forward the memory of love that had proven stronger than law, deeper than difference, and more enduring than the governments that claimed to define the meaning of family.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.